The forest had always been more than just a stretch of trees to the people living nearby. For as long as anyone could remember, it was spoken of in hushed tones, never directly named, always referred to as that place, or the woods where no birds sing. Old maps of the region showed it as an unmarked void, as though even cartographers had decided to leave its boundaries blank. The few who dared to approach its edges claimed they felt something watching them, not the way an animal watches, but in the way a presence far older than humanity observes intruders. For 100 years, it had remained sealed by silence, untouched, avoided, and protected by fear. And yet, despite the warnings, there were always those drawn to the darkness of forgotten legends. The stories passed down over generations spoke of people vanishing into its depths. Farmers said their cattle wandered in and never returned. Hunters who strayed too far never found their way back. Sometimes strange screams echoed through the night, sounds that did not belong to man or beast. The strangest detail, repeated again and again, was that no one ever heard birds singing above those trees. It was as if the forest swallowed not only life, but sound itself. It was precisely this silence that lured a small group of explorers to the edge one gray afternoon. They were not thrill-seekers in the ordinary sense. Some were researchers hoping to uncover historical truths hidden beneath folklore. Others wanted the fame of revealing the truth behind a century-old mystery. One carried expensive recording equipment, determined to document everything. Another carried journals of the earliest settlers in the region, determined to compare fact against fiction. Each of them had convinced themselves that the danger was exaggerated, that the forest was nothing more than an overgrown wilderness, exaggerated into myth by fearful villagers. But they ignored the weight in the air, the invisible heaviness that seemed to thicken as they approached. The dirt road leading up to the tree line grew uneven, and their equipment rattled as they struggled forward. Not one of them spoke as they parked at the clearing. It was not by agreement, but instinct. Words seemed to die in their throats, as though even sound feared trespassing further. For a long moment, they stood before the towering trees, their shadows stretching like guardians. The forest loomed, not inviting them, not resisting, but simply existing in a way that felt wrong. One of the locals who had reluctantly guided them this far remained behind. He was a man in his late 60s, his skin weathered by years of sun and labor. His eyes, however, were the most striking, dark, tired, yet holding a sharpness that cut deeper than his words. "Don't go in there," he muttered. His voice trembled not from age, but from something deeper, something remembered. "We leave it alone for a reason. You think you're chasing stories, but stories are the only way we explain what doesn't let itself be explained. It doesn't like to be disturbed. It never did." When pressed to explain, the old man only shook his head. "All I'll tell you is this: the forest doesn't keep secrets, it swallows them. You'll understand when it's too late." Then he turned his back and walked away quickly, without looking over his shoulder. The explorers exchanged uneasy glances, but dismissed his words as the predictable fear of superstition. They were educated, rational, and prepared. At least, that's what they told themselves. With a sense of nervous determination, they stepped past the boundary into the trees. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Outside there had been wind, the faint buzzing of insects, the occasional cry of a bird. Inside it was nothing. Not quiet in the ordinary sense, but suffocating silence, so deep it pressed against their ears until they felt as though their own heartbeat was too loud. Every crunch of a boot against the damp earth sounded like an intrusion, as though the forest itself resented the disturbance. The air was different here, too, colder, heavier. It smelled faintly of earth and decay, though no rot was visible. The trunks of the trees were wide and dark, their branches tangled overhead like a net designed to trap the light. Daylight filtered in but seemed weaker here, drained of warmth. Shadows pooled unnaturally, stretching longer than they should. Hours passed as they pressed further inside. Their compasses spun without direction, their GPS devices failed to register a signal, and still they convinced themselves it was simply interference. They spoke less and less, their voices hushed, not out of caution but compulsion. Each time someone tried to raise their tone, It was as if the forest itself swallowed the sound before it traveled far. It was one of the younger members of the group who found the first object. Kneeling near the roots of a massive oak, he brushed away damp leaves to uncover a rusted piece of metal. It was a locket, its chain broken, the clasp corroded. Inside, the faint outline of a photograph was still visible, though time had eaten away most of the details. A blurred shape of a child's face remained, hollow-eyed in the fading print. No one said it aloud, but each of them felt it. This locket had been here a very long time, untouched, waiting. As they pressed forward, faint whispers began to reach their ears. At first, they thought it was simply the wind threading through the branches, though the air had been unnervingly still since they entered. The whispers carried no distinct words, only a low, flowing murmur that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. When they stopped, the whispers stopped too. When they moved, the voices returned, following them, circling them. By the second nightfall, the group camped uneasily in a small clearing. Their fire burned weakly, its light barely pushing back the dark. One member swore he saw movement just beyond the firelight, a figure standing still among the trees, taller than any human, its outline blurred as though it was more shadow than substance. But when he called out, no one else saw it. They laughed nervously, dismissing it as fatigue, though the laughter died quickly, leaving behind the same heavy silence. The following day, they stumbled across something more unsettling. Hidden beneath thick moss and roots, half buried in the soil, they uncovered what appeared to be fragments of a wooden sign. Most of it had rotted away, but enough letters remained to piece together the word "Beware." The edges of the sign bore deep gouges, as though someone had clawed at it in desperation. Unease grew into something heavier. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, stretching in directions opposite the light. Their electronic equipment failed entirely, cameras refused to hold charge, microphones picked up only static, though occasionally, beneath the noise, faint voices seemed to whisper their names. Late into the third day, they heard footsteps that weren't their own. Slow, deliberate circling. Each time they turned, there was nothing but trees. Each time they stopped, the steps stopped too. It was no longer possible to dismiss it as paranoia. Something else was moving in the forest, unseen, watching, patient. Exhaustion began to wear on them, but none dared to sleep deeply. When one member finally drifted into restless dreams, he woke screaming, claiming he had heard a voice whisper directly into his ear. The others gathered close, insisting it was only a nightmare, though none could deny that the scream had sounded like more than a dream. It had carried with it a note of pure terror, the kind of fear that words cannot describe. By the end of their first week in the forest, their nerves were unraveling. Food supplies dwindled faster than expected, as if something had tampered with their packs. Objects they left behind were found rearranged, though no one admitted to moving them. Tensions flared as accusations flew, but each argument ended abruptly, smothered by that same crushing silence. It was not ordinary silence. It was oppressive, suffocating, alive. Still, despite everything, they pressed deeper. For each step they took, the forest seemed to close behind them. The path back no longer looked familiar, though they were certain they had marked it. Compasses refused to stabilize, pointing them in circles. They could not tell whether they were moving forward or being guided in loops, led deeper against their will. Then, on the morning of the seventh day, one of them noticed something carved into a tree trunk. The etchings were faded but still legible. "It watches US-AT night." Beneath the words, claw marks raked deep into the bark, far deeper than human hands could make. It was in that moment they realized the stories had not been exaggerated. They were only beginning to scratch the surface of what had been buried here for 100 years. And whatever it was not meant to be disturbed. The forest became a different place after nightfall, as if its true character only awoke when shadows ruled and the air grew colder than bone. The old villagers had always warned that the silence was never really silence, that beneath the stillness, something was listening. When the first explorers stumbled upon a half-buried stone marker covered in claw-like carvings, the story that had been buried for a century started to stir awake. Every step deeper into the woods revealed more questions than answers, and the fear was not in what they saw, but in what they could not. Animals avoided the grove at the heart of the forest, paths twisted unnaturally as though the land itself wanted to disorient the intruders, and the deeper they pressed, the more they felt a weight pressing down upon their very thoughts. The discovery of the underground chamber was not deliberate. It was almost as if the ground gave way beneath them, pulling them into its mouth. The stale air carried a scent like iron and mold, as if 100 years of decay had been trapped below. Faint inscriptions covered the chamber walls, carved by desperate hands, repeating the same words over and over, as though madness itself had been etched into stone. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the people who had carved those marks were not just recording, they were pleading to be remembered, pleading to be freed. The chamber was filled with objects no one expected to find. A child's toy scorched beyond recognition, lanterns blackened with soot, ropes that looked frayed but had never rotted despite the century that had passed. In the center, a wooden coffin sat propped upright, bound by chains that should have rusted long ago but seemed preserved by something unnatural. Every instinct screamed to leave it untouched, but curiosity became an infection stronger than fear. When one of them brushed the chain, the air turned colder, and for the first time, they heard the sound they had been half expecting all along. Faint scratching, not from outside, but from within. Sleep became impossible after that night. Those who returned from the forest claimed they still heard it, even when far from the woods. Dreams were invaded by the sound of breathing close to their ears, by whispers in languages they did not know but understood instinctively as warnings. One man swore he woke to find dirt scattered across his floor, as though something had been clawing its way toward him. Another admitted he could no longer look into mirrors because he no longer saw himself alone in the reflection. The secret had been disturbed, and with it, something had been freed, not fully, not yet, but enough to stretch its reach beyond the forest. The villagers had always known, though few dared to speak. An old woman revealed that her grandmother had been among those who sealed the coffin in chains. A century ago, people had gone missing in the dozens, their bodies never recovered, their voices said to echo through the trees long after. Desperation led to ritual, and the ritual led to binding. The one who was chained was not entirely human, she whispered, but something that had once been human and had changed after being touched by something in the dark woods. When the coffin was sealed, the villagers swore an oath never to disturb it, to let the forest swallow it whole. But oaths were forgotten, and curiosity had awakened the nightmare again. What made the horror worse was not knowing whether it was truly bound still or if the scratching was merely a cruel echo. The chains felt cold to the touch, colder than the air around them, and one by one, those who had entered the chamber felt their minds unraveling. At first, it was paranoia, feeling watched, hearing footsteps when no one was there. Then came the voices that whispered their names in the dark, urging them to return, promising answers if they would only open the coffin. None of them admitted aloud that they wanted to, but each carried the temptation in silence, and temptation grew heavier with every passing night. The forest no longer allowed them to stay away. Paths led them back to the grove, no matter how they tried to avoid it. Birds and beasts that once filled the woods were nowhere to be found, replaced only by the oppressive sound of nothingness. Shadows moved independently of light, stretching too far, bending at angles that defied nature. The land was no longer just cursed, it was alive, feeding on fear, pulling them toward a choice none wanted to make. They realized too late that disturbing the secret had not merely awakened something, it had marked them, bound them to its story, and the forest would not let them leave until the ending was written in blood or silence. The coffin stood at the center of everything. Each night they resisted opening it, the scratching grew louder, more impatient, like nails raking across their skulls from within. One swore he saw the chains shift, another swore the lid had cracked slightly wider, though no one dared to check. The horror of not knowing became worse than the thought of releasing it. What had been hidden for 100 years demanded to be seen, and the forest itself demanded they bear witness. Whether they wanted it or not, the story was not theirs to end, it was the coffin's, and it was only just beginning. The forest no longer waited for them to come. It began to reach beyond its borders, drawing them in with whispers that sounded like loved ones calling from the dark. Doors creaked open at night with no wind to move them, and when they looked out, they saw not their homes but the trees. Somehow the woods had shifted closer, swallowing fields, paths, and roads, until it was no longer possible to tell where the village ended and where the forest began. The secret had outgrown its boundaries, and its hunger no longer cared for the rules of distance or time. Those who had first touched the coffin were the first to feel the change in their bodies. One awoke with soil under his fingernails, though he had not left his bed. Another found her hands stained with dark streaks of resin, though she swore she had not gone near the trees. Each carried a mark, subtle at first but undeniable. Their eyes grew hollow, their voices quieter, and they spoke less to others and more to the shadows around them. It was as though the forest had chosen them as vessels, twisting them slowly into something unrecognizable. The old woman's story had not been complete. She had spoken of a creature bound within the coffin, once human but changed. What she had left unsaid was that it could never be contained forever. The chains and rituals only delayed the inevitable. It had waited 100 years, feeding off silence, waiting for hands reckless enough to disturb it again. Now that its coffin had been touched, its chains weakened, and its whispers stretched farther with every passing night. The scratching had grown so loud it no longer came only from inside the coffin. It came from inside their own skulls, clawing at their sanity. It became clear that the forest was no longer a place, but a living organism, with roots like veins, branches like skeletal arms, and the coffin as its heart. The coffin was not a prison but a seed, and the seed had germinated the moment it was unearthed. The scratching was not of someone trying to get out, but of something trying to grow through those who had disturbed it, and it was succeeding. One by one, they disappeared. Search parties entered the woods, but never returned. Lanterns dropped on paths were later found extinguished, lying beside deep drag marks that led off the trail. Every disappearance was marked by a scream in the distance that cut short, swallowed as if the trees themselves had mouths. At first the village mourned, then it grew silent, too afraid to acknowledge what was happening, but silence fed the thing. The less they spoke of it, the more power it seemed to have, as if secrecy was its nourishment. When the coffin finally split open, it was not with a loud crash, but with a whisper. The chains did not snap. They unraveled, falling like dead snakes onto the cold stone floor. The lid creaked aside by inches, and those watching swore they saw nothing inside, just endless darkness that seemed to move like liquid shadow. Yet the scratching did not stop. It grew louder, multiplied, until it felt as though thousands of nails were clawing from every direction. They realized too late that the coffin had never held a body. It had held a void, a hunger shaped into something that could wear flesh when it chose to. From that night onward, the forest never slept. The shadows were no longer tricks of the eyes. They moved with purpose, circling, stalking. Shapes resembling the lost villagers began to appear among the trees, but their movements were wrong, their limbs bending unnaturally, their mouths open in silence though whispers poured out from them. Those who looked too long into their faces claimed they saw their own reflections staring back, distorted and waiting to be replaced. The horror was not only that the secret had been freed, but that it wanted to consume identities, to wear every soul as a mask until no one remained untouched. The final survivors tried to burn the grove, but flames refused to spread. Firelight twisted into shapes of screaming faces before dying out, leaving behind only ash that the wind carried back toward their homes. The forest could not be destroyed by human means because it was no longer of this world. It had grown out of something deeper, something beneath the roots of time itself. The only option left was to leave, but the moment they stepped beyond the village borders, they found themselves back at the same path, as though the world itself had looped. The coffin's influence had expanded so far that even escape was no longer possible. Night after night, the scratching grew until it was all they could hear. Food lost its taste, water turned bitter, and the air felt too heavy to breathe. Sleep became a descent into a darkness that no dream could explain. And then came the calling, each one hearing their name whispered from the trees, voices of loved ones long gone, voices impossible to resist. Those who followed the sound never returned, their absence marked only by new whispers added to the chorus the next night. The forest was collecting them, binding them into its endless story, adding layer upon layer of silence and screams. What had been hidden for a century was never meant to stay buried forever. The coffin had been a warning, not a protection. The villagers of the past had not trapped it, they had only delayed the inevitable. The forest itself was its body, the shadows its limbs, and the whispers its breath. The coffin was nothing more than a heartbeat, waiting for curious hands to feel its pulse again. And once touched, it no longer slept. Now the land carries no maps, no paths, only trees that stretch endlessly in every direction. To enter it is to become part of it, to lose your reflection, your voice, your very sense of self. The creepiest secret hidden in the forest for 100 years was never about what lay inside the coffin. The true horror is that the forest is not haunted, it is alive, and every soul it claims becomes one of its roots. It does not stop. It only waits, patient and eternal, until the next set of footsteps wanders too close. And when they do, the scratching begins again, just as it always has, just as it always will. They thought the coffin was the heart, but the forest had another layer, one even older than the roots themselves. Beneath the soil, beneath the stone, beneath every step taken in that cursed place, there was something buried deeper still, something waiting long before the coffin was ever carved. The coffin was only an echo, a doorway meant to distract those curious enough to disturb it, but the true core lay further down, below centuries of earth and silence. What was freed was not a single entity, but a fragment, and that fragment was enough to spread through the forest like veins filling with black blood. The villagers who had resisted for so long began to change in ways no sickness could explain. Their shadows stretched against the light, lengthening far beyond their bodies, touching the ground like claws. Their reflections in water bent backward, smiling when they were not, blinking when their eyes stayed still. The old woman who once warned them vanished from her home, leaving behind only a circle of ash on her floor. Some whispered that she had always known this was her fate, that she had been marked since childhood to feed the forest when the time came. Others believed she had never been human at all, only a mouth through which the trees could speak. Night became unbearable. The forest hummed with a sound no one could describe, a vibration that shook bones but could not be heard by the ears. Animals had long abandoned the land. No bird sang, no wolf howled, no insect crawled. Yet the silence was never empty. It was full, dense, alive, pressing against the skull like unseen hands. When the villagers tried to cover their ears, they still heard it inside their heads. The sound grew into patterns, and the patterns became words, words that did not belong to any human tongue but were understood all the same. Words that promised freedom, power, and eternal life, if only they surrendered themselves completely. But surrender was never a choice. It happened slowly, with each breath taken inside that cursed place. Their footsteps grew heavier, as if the soil itself clung to their ankles. Their dreams bled into their waking lives, until they could no longer tell if they were standing in their homes or wandering between endless trees. One man tried to carve a path out by cutting down the trees around him. His axe struck once, twice, and on the third swing, his scream echoed through the night. In the morning, his house stood where the tree had been, but it was not made of wood or stone. It was made of flesh, its walls pulsing as though alive. Inside, there was no family, only the coffin, waiting with its lid half open, the scratching now replaced by breathing. It became clear then that the coffin did not move, the world did. Wherever they went, the coffin appeared. It was in the forest, in their homes, in their dreams. Its presence no longer depended on space. It had become a constant, as unavoidable as the sky above them. Each time it appeared, the lid was further open. Each time, more shadows spilled from it like smoke, curling along the ground, reaching with invisible fingers toward anything living. The children were the first to vanish completely. At first they were only restless, unable to sleep, muttering in voices not their own. They spoke to corners of rooms, to the air, to cracks in the walls. Then they stopped speaking at all. They simply walked into the forest, hand in hand, their eyes pale and unblinking. Parents chased after them, but the children did not look back. By morning, the parents too were gone, their houses silent, their windows dark. The whispers grew louder with every absence. The few who remained realized too late that they were not fighting something that wanted them dead. Death would have been mercy. What the forest wanted was for them to remain, hollowed out, filled with whispers, reshaped into something that resembled them but was no longer theirs. Their bodies would walk, but their souls would be roots, tied forever into the soil of the cursed land. That was the fate of the missing, the reason why shapes resembling them wandered the trees with movements like broken marionettes. They were not ghosts, they were harvests,